Good evening and welcome to the National Air and Space Museum. My name is Chris Brown and I serve as a Deputy Director of this great museum. Earlier today, the city and nation celebrated the life and service of our 41st President, George Herbert Walker Bush. While he will long be remembered for his many enduring and laudable achievements, it is most fitting that here at the National Air and Space Museum, on this evening, we remember his service as a naval aviator. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a young George Bush, anxious to serve his country, joined the United States Navy as soon as he turned 18. When he earned his wings less than a year later, he became the Navy's youngest pilot. He went on to fly the TBM Avenger torpedo bomber, launching on 58 combat missions from the carrier USS San Jacinto in the South Pacific. After being shot down and rescued at sea, Lieutenant Bush was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 Air Medals for his service to our country during the greatest human struggle of the 20th century. And as we well know, his wartime experience instilled a commitment to service that followed him well into public life. It is therefore with great respect and gratitude for the contributions of George Bush that I invite you to join me in a moment of silence honoring his life as a World War II veteran, elder statesman, and American hero. Thank you. My colleagues and I appreciate you taking the time to join us for the final GE Aviation Lecture of the year. You may not realize it, but this lecture series is the museum's longest-running sponsored program. Since 1982, we've hosted more than 150 programs and lectures free of charge. And simply put, none of this would have been possible if not for the notable generosity and support from GE Aviation. Representing GE Aviation in the audience tonight is Ms. Darby Becker from her company's Government Affairs and Policy Division. Please join me in recognizing Darby and her colleagues at GE Aviation for all their generosity and support. With help from partners like GE, we are able to educate and inspire new generations of visitors for decades to come. And this support is more important than ever as we transform our home here on the National Mall from the inside out and reimagine each of our 23 galleries. You can already see the beginning signs of our renovation of the museum. Earlier this week, we closed Looking at Earth and Apollo to the Moon galleries, and shortly after the holidays, we'll begin to close more of the galleries on the west end of the building. We have this and a lot of other big changes coming, but don't worry, we are committed to remain at least partially reopened throughout the whole process. Over the course of the next 6 years, there will always be something inspiring to see here at Air and Space. And when the whole museum reopens in 2024, you will find the place entirely transformed and even more impressive than ever. This lecture series celebrates innovators and groundbreaking achievements in aviation, and tonight's speakers certainly fit the bill. I am excited to hear from our guests as they share stories of their experiences in the airline industry and how they overcame the barriers that tried to slow their career growth. Thank you very much to Beverley Bass, Brad Lang, and Rafiwe Ledwaba for being here with us tonight. Our moderator, Phil Tiemeyer, will provide more complete introductions in a moment. Dr. Tiemeyer is an associate professor of history at Kansas State University and has twice served as a research fellow here at the National Air and Space Museum. He is the author of the award-winning book, Plain Queer: Labor, Sexuality, and the AIDS in the History of Male Flight Attendants, and is currently working on a book project examining air travel during the Cold War, with a focus on the expansion of U.S. carriers and the establishment of new national airlines in the developing world. At this point, I'll hand it over to Phil, who will introduce our speakers and moderate what I know will be an engaging and enlightening conversation. Bill?
Good evening. As moderator tonight, my main job is to introduce three extremely exquisite speakers who have a really interesting set of experiences in the aviation industry. But also part of my job is to look for commonalities. And I think the biggest commonality that I see is that they started out the way I did, and so many of us who enter this amazing museum, as little kids who dream about flying. And for a lot of us, that's where it ends, right? It's just a dream. I get to read about it, study it, teach it. But these individuals made extraordinary careers happen. And the other thing is, as children, they had to overcome voices that encouraged them not to pursue aviation as a career, piloting as a career. So we're here tonight to kind of hear different perspectives about the wonderful accomplishments and always cognizant of the limitations that were being encouraged, either for race-based boundaries or for gender-based boundaries or because of situations like apartheid in South Africa, right? As we hear these stories, that's what I'm going to be listening to. What was it about that child that allowed each of these individuals to persevere? Our first guest is Beverley Bass. She was born and raised in Fort Myers, Florida, and is a graduate of Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. In 1976, she became the third female pilot hired by American Airlines, and 10 years later was American's first female captain. Her career spanned 32 years, and she flew nearly every jet in American's fleet and became the world's first female to captain a Boeing 777 in an airline operation. On September 11th, 2001, Beverley was flying from Paris to Dallas, something you've probably done many times before. But this one ended up grounded in the remote town of Gander, Newfoundland, for the next 5 days. So the story of this unexpected stayover and her sparkling career as a pilot made it all the way to Broadway, right, in the hit musical Come From Away. Here to tell us both about her career and her experience on September 11th is Captain Beverley Bass.
Thank you, Phil. If I had known that being a pilot meant I had to give speeches, I might have chosen a different profession. No, all kidding aside, it is a privilege for me to be here this evening to share my story with all of you in a venue as legendary as the Smithsonian. Over the years, I suppose the questions I'm asked most frequently is, what made me want to be a pilot, and what was it like in the early years with the airlines? When I was around 4 years old, we used to visit the neighbors, and they had a statue of Icarus. And I used to study his wings that were made of wax and feathers. And as the legend goes, he was warned not to fly too close to the sun, which of course he did, and his wings melted, and he landed in the sea. Once we were back home, I would climb up on the washing machine in our kitchen, and I would attempt to fly across the room. But much like Icarus, I too landed up in a heap on the kitchen floor. In the early 1960s, National Airlines would fly their brand new Boeing 727s from Tampa to Fort Myers, landing every night at about 9 o'clock. I would beg my Aunt Ginger to take me out to the airport so I could watch that one airplane land, we would stand right next to the chain link fence, and I would pick up its landing lights as it made its descent into Fort Myers. When the airplane landed, I remember thinking that the guys in the cockpit had the coolest job in the world. And I knew right then that that was what I wanted to do someday. When I was 16, I asked my parents if I could take flying lessons, and they said no. And the reason for that was we were very busy in the horse business. We were raising, training, and showing registered quarter horses. And I think my father thought if I started flying, I would lose interest in the horses. And he loved the horse business because it kept me away from boys. So when I left for college in 1970, we sold the ranch, and I took my first flying lesson after my freshman year at TCU. I came home from that lesson, I walked into the house, and I announced to my parents that I would fly for the rest of my life. Of course, back then, I didn't know in what capacity, but I knew it would be forever. It was my passion. My parents raised me to believe that no dream was too big, as long as I was willing to work hard to achieve my goals. I am an only child who hunted on horseback with my father in the Everglades at night. And I was in fashion shows with my mother during the week. There is no doubt they supported me every step of the way. But what they failed to tell me is there was something called gender discrimination. I went to college during the day and spent the afternoons and evenings working on my flight ratings and licenses. I applied for numerous jobs with lots of aircraft experience under my belt, but I was turned down with statements such as, "You have a lot of experience in the airplane, but we just can't have a woman flying our airplanes." All it takes is that one person to give you a break in life. And for me, it was a gentleman by the name of Lynn Stiles. He lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and he was a mortician, and he kept his body hauling bonanza at our flight school. So one day he needed a pilot, and I happened to be the only pilot around. He needed a girl who was 19 years old to be flown to Hope, Arkansas. She had died of an overdose. I flew her, and I was only 21 years old at the time. For the next 2 years, I flew for him, logging hundreds of hours of flight time, and my pay was $5 an hour. It was my first break and my first flying job. From there, I went on to become the chief pilot of a charter department, and I flew for 2 corporations, and then eventually took a night freight job out of Dallas Love Field, flying freight 5 nights a week. In 1973, Frontier Airlines became the first modern-day airline to hire a female pilot. Some of you may know her as Emily Warner. 2 months later, American Airlines hired Bonnie Tabersi. I was still in college when Bonnie was hired, and I remember I had her photo taped to the mirror in my dorm room. Even though American was one of the first airlines to employ female pilots, there were concerns about our longevity. They feared that we would get married, have children, and quit flying. That would defeat the huge investment that they put into each and every pilot throughout their airline career. So I remember distinctly during my interview, I was quite emphatic. I told them I had no plans to get married. I certainly wouldn't be having any children. And I made it very clear that I was in for the long haul because I wanted to fly the biggest jets that American had in their fleet. In 1976, I was hired as American's third female pilot, and I joined a very small group of women pilots. There were only 14 others in the United States at that time. We had nearly 4,000 pilots on the seniority list, and there were only 3 of us at American, so we were novelties for sure. We were known by our first names only, and every cockpit we entered had never flown with a female aviator. We were like interlopers. We would walk through the airport terminals, we were stared at, we were whispered about, and we were smiled at. Many passengers would take the time to speak to us. It really was a very exciting time. We no doubt presented challenges to American with regard to our uniform. We actually had a female blouse, female tie, and a female hat. So I was always very grateful for that because many of the other airlines dress their female pilots up like men. So I felt very happy that we got to look like female aviators instead of dressing in our father's clothes. In 1977, I met Stephanie Wallach. She was a pilot for Braniff, and we actually lived in the same apartment building in New York City. We were the only 2 female airline pilots in New York City at that time, so the fact that we lived in the same apartment building was amazing. We became instant friends, and we used to meet for lunch, and we thought, how fun would it be if we could meet the other women airline pilots who flew for the various carriers? So we pounded out a letter on a manual typewriter and sent it to the chief pilots of every airline that we knew had female pilots. So it was 1978 when we had our first convention in Las Vegas. There were 21 of us, and we formed a social organization called ISA, International Society of Women Airline Pilots. We are very involved in mentoring young female aviators, and we are the largest single donor of scholarship money, which now totals over $1.3 million. Unfortunately, though, women still only represent approximately 5% of the airline pilot population, so we're trying to grow that number. It has been said by many that I had a charmed career, and I would have to agree to that. I flew every airplane I wanted to, and I was an instructor pilot for 16 years on 4 different jets. There have been many milestones throughout my career that spanned over 3 decades, but I have attributed many of those to the seniority system and the way it works. I had the privilege of being the first female captain for American in 1986, and only 1 month later had the first all-female crew on a 727. After a 2-year stint as captain, I was honored to have been asked to be a check airman, which is an instructor pilot. I am grateful to the chief pilots for not only approving my application, but for taking a chance with me. None of us knew how the senior captains would respond to getting a check ride by a relatively new captain whose uniform hat didn't look like theirs. Needless to say, they were stoic professionals, and we quickly realized that it was never a problem. Now I'm going to fast forward to 1998. American had purchased the brand new Boeing 777. I was invited to be one of the original 22 instructors who would be responsible for introducing the aircraft and developing the training system for the pilots at American Airlines. We were wined and dined by Boeing in Seattle as we awaited the delivery of our first airplane. It truly was like waiting for the birth of a new baby. They even passed out cigars. Those were the glory days. We were making money, buying jets, and hiring lots of pilots. I'm sure nearly every person in this room can remember where they were the exact moment they learned about the events of 9/11. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I was. I was on the other side of the Atlantic in Paris preparing for our 10-hour flight back to Dallas. And we were over the middle of the North Atlantic. We had just finished having lunch. It was an absolutely beautiful day. And we heard on our air-to-air frequency, which is a frequency that we monitor over international waters because we're out of touch with air traffic control. And somebody came on the frequency and said one of the World Trade Towers had been hit by an airplane. And like many of us, we just assumed it was a small airplane, and not that that's not terrible, but it never entered our mind that it would be an airliner. About 20 minutes later, we heard that the second tower had been hit. And with that came the word terrorism. We quickly learned that not only New York's airspace was closed, but all of the US airspace was closed. So that obviously meant that we would be diverting our airplane somewhere in Canada. We started programming our computers for the larger cities like Toronto, Montreal, even Edmonton and Calgary. Then the next report that we heard on the air-to-air frequency was that at 50 degrees west longitude, as we proceeded westbound, we would get our orders as to where we were going to land. And we as airline pilots don't normally get orders. We coordinate our diversions with our dispatchers, but on that day, it was different. We were the 36th airplane out of 38 wide bodies to land in Gander, Newfoundland in a 3-hour period. We were nearly 7,000 passengers and crew members who invaded a tiny, desolate town of 9,400 people. So we nearly doubled their population. We landed at approximately 10 in the morning on September 11th. They came on our airplane and they said, "You will not be getting off until the next day." So we were on the airplane with our 156 passengers for 28 hours. We stayed for 5 days and were literally treated like distinguished guests. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, my husband and I returned to Gander. And that is when we met the playwrights, Irene Sankoff and David Hine. They asked if they could interview me, and of course I said yes. The interview lasted between 3 and 4 hours. In the summer of 2015, we got a call from the producers of the musical Come From Away, inviting us to the world premiere in La Jolla, California. We had no idea what we were there to see. I didn't know that my role was somewhat prominent in the show, and I certainly didn't know that there had been a song that is 4 minutes and 19 seconds called Me in the Sky that totally chronicles my aviation career. So it was quite an experience for us, needless to say. Come From Away continues to play every night to sell out crowds with 3 companies, and soon we'll add 2 more. It is still on Broadway, Toronto, and the US tour is crisscrossing the United States for 108 weeks. It opens in Dublin next week and will move to London's West End. And it will then open in Australia in the summer of 2019. My children, you know, the ones I was never going to have, yeah, they are now 26 and 27, and my daughter has chosen to follow in my footsteps and was recently flying a Global Express jet in a worldwide operation and is currently a first officer with American Eagle. People often ask me if she is getting her flying experience much the same way that I did. And I say, well, not exactly. I was flying one body at a time in a single-engine Bonanza, and she was flying Elton John, Justin Timberlake, and Maroon 5. And she makes a whole lot more than $5 an hour. I continued to fly for 7 years after 9/11, but elected to retire early in 2008. I was in my 32nd year of the most amazing journey anyone could have asked for. I can honestly say that I was right about those guys that I used to watch land that Boeing 727 as an 8-year-old child. They did have the most exciting job in the world, and I was lucky enough to live that dream. And today, I'm flying a private jet that is owned by a female CEO of the world's largest real estate franchise, Keller Williams. Now, I would like to share a brief video of the amazing musical, Come From Away. You will have the opportunity to see Sue Frost, who is one of the producers of the show, and the writers, David Hine and Irene Sankoff. Thank you very much.
Time now for Broadway Balances America, our series that takes you behind the scenes of some of the most beloved Broadway musicals as they appear across the country in your local theaters.
Today, the original musical Come From Away, which tells the personal stories of both the generous folks of Newfoundland, Canada, and the passengers whose planes were diverted there immediately following the events of September 11, 2001.
Amber Milt has more on how somewhere in the middle of nowhere provided a safe harbor for thousands.
One of those 7,000 come-from-aways was American Airlines captain Beverley Bass, whose plane was flying from Paris to Dallas on that fateful day. This pioneering pilot story was pivotal to the creation of the musical.
I was the 36 out of 38 wide bodies to land that day. And when I was on final approach, I'm looking around, and I mean, honestly, it looked like there wasn't even enough space to park the airplane. So we got parked, and it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and they came on the airplane and told us we wouldn't be getting off until the next day. So when we got off at 7:30 the next morning, we walked into the terminal, and of course, we'd been up all night. We're exhausted. And it was probably the first time that I realized that we had landed in an incredible place, because when we walked into the terminal, it was lined with tables and tables of food.
She was the first female captain for American Airlines, but it wasn't because she was trying to make a statement, it was because she loved to fly, and that's what she wanted to do.
So you really paved the way for so many women, including your daughter, to follow in your footsteps in a field that was so dominated by men.
I am so grateful that our paving the way has helped the next generation of female pilots, and hopefully it's a little bit easier for them.
Compiling so many stories into one musical means that the actors play multiple roles and that the staging is stark and effective in its simplicity.
It's a wonderful metaphor for anyone being able to step into each other's shoes. We've got a line in the show that because we come from everywhere, we all come from away. And each of our actors plays either a come from away or a local, and at any minute we could either be welcomed or we could be welcoming people. And there's something wonderful about remembering that. What they remember, their experience of that day, was people responding with kindness.
It's not really a 9/11 story. It's about all the wonderful things that happened the next day. The kindness, the generosity, all the things that people did for us.
I feel like that's the good thing that comes out of tragedy in life, is people come together.
It is a global story. Everybody has a memory of that day, and if they're not old enough to have a memory of that day, they live in the world that was created that day.
I've seen it 107 times. I laugh, I cry at different parts in the show, and at the end of the show, my face hurts because I have smiled so much. I never get tired of it.
there's so many neat threads to Beverly's story, and if I could just pull one out, it's legacy. The fact that you were able to give your daughter the dream and the reality of a life in aviation. Our next speaker, Brad Lang, we can rightly say, is a member of the first generation of African Americans to be born into an aviation family. His father, Donald W. Lang Sr., was a documented original Tuskegee Airman, serving his country in World War II in a supporting role in the U.S. military's only pilot corps that was open to African American men. Brad himself grew up in West Orange, New Jersey, and ultimately attended Beloit College in Wisconsin and Purdue University in Indiana. In time, Brad became a pilot with Delta Airlines, where he still works. He's now logged 21,000 hours of flight time, mainly piloting 757s and 767s out of LAX, so look for him on your next Delta flight out of LAX. Brad's professional career, though, is only part of his contribution to aviation. In fact, his passion for flying consumes much of his free time as well. Since 1997, he's been involved with the Commemorative Air Force Red Tail Squadron. You'll hear a lot about this in Brad's talk. This squadron has painstakingly reconstructed a World War II era P-51C Mustang. So this is the same type of aircraft that was used by the original Tuskegee Airmen. Brad was also a member of the 1999 U.S. Advanced Acrobatic Team that competed in the Czech Republic. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you Captain Brad Lang.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for coming to the Smithsonian. And hopefully this evening you'll learn that you can make a difference and learn about some of the things that influenced me as a young boy and later on as a young man as I pursued a career in aviation and started flying for the Commemorative Air Force. Remember that it is possible to inspire young people, and I'll show you and give you some examples of folks who inspired me when I was much younger. I'll talk a little bit about being young in New Jersey, how I got involved in aviation initially, also the airline life, flying for Delta, and finally the Commemorative Air Force Red Tail Squadron. In New Jersey, we've got my parents, Donald W. Lang, and also my mother, Helen Lang. My mother was actually a graduate in DC from Howard University. She was the head of the Board of Education Social Workers back in the 70s and 80s. Dad, of course, Tuskegee Airman, went to Fairleigh Dickinson College. He worked two jobs, one at the Housing Authority in Newark, New Jersey during the day in the relocation department, and at night he worked at the airport for the U.S. Post Office. My parents stressed love, discipline, affection in order to raise us to be productive in life. They were friendly, but I never, ever considered them my friends, and I didn't want to hang out with them. Now, Dad was very old school, as I said, and at an early age, he and my mom said to my brother and myself, you're going to experience discrimination in the U.S. and prejudice. Now, you have these cards, what are you going to do with them? Figure out a way to work around them. So I did. I also thought my father was the hardest working man outside of James Brown and invented the Protestant work ethic. I attended two schools, a private school when I was in my elementary years, and later on went to West Orange High School. The elementary school was called Pingree in Hillside, New Jersey. Now, even though my father was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen, he didn't talk about the Tuskegee Airmen that much until I started getting involved to rebuild the fighter. Now, for those of you who are not aware, the Tuskegee Airman is a term that refers to all who were involved, black, white, men or women, enlisted or officers, in the Tuskegee experience at any of the bases down in Tuskegee, Alabama, back in 1941 to 1949. So we want to include everyone. We call them a Tuskegee Airman because for every one pilot, it had 14 support personnel. They were just as important to keep the pilots flying. Now, while Dad talked about flying airplanes and his experiences, I often said, how did I actually get into aviation? Really, it was my mother, because she was part of the National Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, and she took me out birding. And I still sight birds. So what does that mean to me? I started looking up. At the same time, I had some other folks coming into my life. At Pingree, the professor of the English department was George Moffett. He had just given a presentation on the 1970 World Soaring Championships, which he won. And I tried to bug Mr. Moffett in the library every chance I could to talk to him about aspect ratios and gliding effects of different airplanes. Now, I'm in fourth and fifth grade, that's just not normal. But Mr. Moffett took the time to talk to me, and all the other students feared him because he was a very serious guy. But with me, he said, Brad, come out to the back of the athletic field, I'll show you the glider trailer. And I was like, okay, let me go. And at the same time, I had a gentleman that I met that you will see. This gentleman, we were coming back from New York, going through Paramus, New Jersey, and I thought I saw what was a bird. It wasn't a bird, it was a model airplane, a radio control model airplane, being flown at about 130 miles an hour, doing these precision maneuvers that I had never seen, loops and rolls. My father, being the stoic World War II guy, would not pull over until my mom said, Donald, pull the car over. So while Mom stayed in the car, we got out, and this gentleman, his name was Jersey Jim Martin, flying this Banshee aircraft, was actually one of the best flyers in the world, and by chance we happened to see him. That's Jim Martin 5 years ago when I came through here with the Mustang. I took him for a flight. I had not seen the gentleman in 40-some years. What a great experience. Now, that being said, that leads me to getting into the CAP to get into flying. And flying was something that I knew I wanted to do, particularly as an airline pilot, but I didn't know how to get there. And the reason I say an airline pilot is because one day we're at Newark Airport, one Sunday morning, it's overcast, and I see this United Airlines freighter coming out of the sky. And I said to my father, how could folks do this? And he said, you know, they're called airline pilots. You might want to think about it if you like flying. So I actually developed that sense of wonder from watching these airplanes come out of the sky. And from high school, I went to Beloit College. And from Beloit College, I worked on my private license and went to Purdue University, got my flight engineer certificate, started flight instructing down in St. Pete, Clearwater, Florida, in the Tampa area. And then the whole issue with me was, how do I get on with the airlines? And because we had great students at Purdue that would network, which is very important, we stayed in contact with students, which I did. They actually taught me that flight instruction was great, but flying for the commuters is better as a vehicle to get on with the airlines. So I got a job with Atlantic Southeast Airlines. This picture is a picture of myself and a gentleman named Ozzie Ross. This was his last flight at ASA. At the time, there were 400 pilots, and there were 4 black pilots. Ozzie retired from American Airlines about 3 years ago. Another great influence in my life. Now, after the experience at ASA and after Purdue, I said, are there any other students out there older who can help me get it on with another company? Well, there were several folks flying for American, several folks flying for Delta. I interviewed with Delta in 1988. I've been a captain for 14 years with them. I spent 10 years flying the MD-88 in Dallas. And then in 1988, moved out to California. I've been on the 75, 767 for the past 20 years. And it's a great job, and I love flying, but I wanted to give back and do something that was more important. And the airline flying gave me the opportunity to reach out and do something more significant. And one of the things I always enjoyed flying was precision aerobatics. So I was actually competing at the US Nationals back in Sherman, Texas, and several of the folks had met my father, who was watching me fly, And they knew I had lots of tail dragger time, and they said, you know, there's a Mustang being restored up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, by the Confederate Air Force. And they said, you should join because you have the experience to fly it. I talked to my father about that, and as soon as I mentioned Confederate, he said, not a good idea. However, there was another airman who actually thought the idea of talking about the airplane and the history of the airman with a Mustang would get people's attention as an educational gaffe. So I actually joined the CAF, which is now the Commemorative Air Force, and met this gentleman named Don Hines. Don was a businessman up in Minnesota who actually put his personal time and experience and corrupted me by saying this is much better than flying Pitts aircraft and extras at the Nationals. And I had to say to him at this time, was there anyone else who looked like me flying warbirds? Now, honestly, I didn't care about flying the Mustang. If the Airmen had won the war in a Corsair, I'd be flying a Corsair. If they had won in a J3 Cub, I would have saved a lot of money. But the thing was, the Mustang was a premier aircraft. And in 60 years of flying, there had never been a black civilian flying a Mustang or any World War II fighter. So I thought, let me redirect what I want to do. The chance to go out and give back to the community is much more important than my personal satisfaction of flying these smaller airplanes in competition. And getting involved with the Commemorative Air Force was great because there were also so many other members flying all different types of World War II aircraft to make a difference for those of you who don't know anything about World War II or the men and women who participated in World War II. Don, unfortunately, was killed in an accident in the airplane in 2004. But with this blessing, we decided to resurrect the aircraft. And the aircraft goes together much like a big radio-controlled airplane. You build it in parts. This is the section of the aircraft, fuselage being joined with the wing, as you would with a model airplane. This is the airplane as it's, once again, being united with the radiator. My father also said to me after I started getting involved with this in 1996, let me tell you about my experiences. So the airplane actually opened up a discussion about his experiences back in World War II, which he rarely talked about because he considered going to war or actually being involved as just part of his duty, civic duty, military duty. He was a patriot. This is Joe Gomer, one of the original Tuskegee Airmen who actually flew. And he lived in Minneapolis, was responsible for getting the aircraft together. Now, while Don's dream was to actually build this educational gaff that we use as a tool to get your attention with that beautiful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine singing up in the air, the greater good was to try to expose more people. And the only way to do that was for us to actually build a ground support system, which consists of a trailer that seats 30 to 40 kids. It's free, it's air conditioned. We can get into communities for 2 or 3 days and do community outreach work and then move the trailer out to the airport or to a location where the airplane will arrive and often documented Tuskegee Airmen. It's not a singular effort. This is our team that actually does all the volunteer work, and most of us are volunteers. I brought the aircraft back to Purdue, and these are some of my professors that knew me when I had a big afro. This is Bob Friend, another pilot of the P-51C Mustang in World War II, and he frequently joins us when we have the exhibit and the trailer on the road. This is Buddy Huntley, and he's one of the first Tuskegee types to say, why do folks, and he was a mechanic, the chief, crew chief on the P-51 Skipper's Darling. And he said to me, why do people always talk about Jug Turner, my pilot? He flew 100 missions, but without me, he would have never flown. And his point was, it takes a team, and you always hear about the quarterback, but you never hear about the line blocking for the quarterback or for the running backs. And that was Uncle Buddy, who passed away many years ago. These are the other pilot supporters and sponsors of the aircraft. When you're out flying the air shows, frequently you get a chance to join up with other aircraft. This was down at New Smyrna Beach several years ago. Also, you have these very unique opportunities that occur. This summer in June, the Montgomery Fighter Squadron, which is one of the modern-day descendants of the 332nd Fighter Group. They fly F-16 Red Tails. We're producing an air show. And I thought that this would be a great time to have the F-16 Red Tail. And the F-22 Raptor is also from another Tuskegee Squadron, 302nd Fighter Squadron. And with the P-51 Mustang, the pilots who were involved in flying these aircraft thought, what a great event if we could just take these airplanes over to Tuskegee and do a mission to salute the airmen who actually made this all happen for us to break the ice, particularly if you're a black aviator, but just give hope if you think that you can't rise above your challenges in life. This is the inbound as we're rolling into the Tuskegee Moulton Field. This is the outbound photo of us, a 3-ship going back to Montgomery. This is another shot that was taken along the way. These are the pilots that were involved. And one of the things we always try to tell people is that the airmen didn't just get there because they were lucky, but they had certain values that were very important. And the Red Tail Squadron gives out a dog tag that looks like this to all the kids who go in and out of our exhibit. And these 6 principles we use to try to drive to kids that they can do anything to rise above adversity. And the principles are aim high, believe in yourself, use your brain, be ready to go, never quit, expect to win. We've been very fortunate since 2011. We've had over 240,000 visitors to the exhibit, and over 125,000 youngsters have been in the exhibit and met some of the airmen who made this all possible. So once again, it is possible to reach out, touch kids, not everyone, but maybe you'll see one spark, the shy girl in the back, the kid in the front who's sitting down and not raising his hand. We take them by the hand, put them in the Mustang, and give them a little hope and inspiration. And at the end of the day, this is why we do it. That smiling face is what I was like when I saw Jersey Jim Martin, when I saw George Moffett, and hopefully he will remember this and say to himself, I can do this to rise above anybody. So, excuse me for a second, if I can figure this out. I want to thank everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of the inspirational events that we do to help support kids and get them to start thinking about moving forward in life and being successful folks as they get a little bit older. And we want to thank the Smithsonian for having us. Thank you.
Brad talked about growing up with a passion for flight in a culture that was embedded in discrimination. And he said, those are the cards you're dealt with. What are you going to do about it, right? Our next speaker, Refilwe Lidwaba, grew up in apartheid-era South Africa with that same bug, that same passion for flight. Upon completing university studies at the University of Cape Town, she entered the field of aviation and proceeded to break down both racial boundaries and gender-based boundaries in her home country. She worked for 10 years as an officer and a helicopter pilot for the South African Police Service, becoming the first black woman to fly for the police service. And thereafter, she flew as a commercial fixed-wing pilot in South Africa. Refilwe has also had an amazingly rich career on the ground. She is the founder of Girls Fly Program in Africa Foundation, which we'll hear a lot about this evening. This program introduces young girls to flying and to the importance of getting a STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math. The program currently operates in South Africa, Botswana, and Cameroon, and it's going to be expanding quite soon. Through the foundation, she was featured on the BBC as a top innovator in Africa. Refilwe is also the founder of Southern African Women in Aviation and Aerospace Industry, and she's the founder and executive director of Women in Aviation, The latter is a hybrid organization that's devoted towards economic empowerment and leadership development of women in the aviation and aerospace industries in Africa. It's my pleasure to introduce to you a social entrepreneur and a pilot who's passionate about youth development and the empowerment of women in Africa, Ms. Rifilwe Lidwaba.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Phil, for that kind introduction. It's been a really great pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to be sharing the platform with Beverley and Brad and hearing their amazing stories. I am thoroughly inspired by your stories and your journeys. My journey was a little bit different. I wish I could begin this presentation by telling you how at the age of 3 or at the age of 4, I developed a passion for flying. I wish I could tell you how my parents, my aunt, my teachers, and uncles encouraged me to pursue my dream. I wish I could tell you it was easy, but it wasn't. In reality, I started life on a bit of a back foot. A black woman born into the apartheid system in South Africa, which automatically categorized me as a second-class citizen. Just to give you a bit of a context, during apartheid, we had 2 separate education systems. We had a black education system, which was termed Bantu education, and that was designed to prepare black people for the life of laboring class. I soon realized that to be more, to reach my full potential would take an extraordinary effort on my part. Lifting myself out of the small township in the Limpopo province of South Africa that I called home would require me to master all the resources at my disposal. But as the great Nelson Mandela once said, it always seems impossible until it is done. These words kept repeating through my brain this past weekend as South Africa celebrated the Global Citizen Festival and paid tribute to Nelson Mandela. He would have turned 100 this year. And just to give you a bit of my background, I grew up as one of 7 children, and we were raised by a single mother. From a very young age, she instilled in us a culture of hard work. She was a school teacher, so we grew up with books around us. Blessed with a good brain and a drive to make the most out of it, I initially set my sight on becoming a doctor. That was until one fateful day, 18 years ago, when I was 18 years old and already studying towards a Bachelor of Science degree at the University of Cape Town. On that day, I piloted a plane I boarded a plane piloted by a woman. Up until then, the closest I've seen an aeroplane was on TV. I also never knew that was a career option for me. That day changed the course of my life forever. That is when the seed got planted. In Africa, we're fond of storytelling. In fact, we're legendary at it, which is why we like to celebrate individual stories of success across industries and sectors. In the aviation sector, I've been lucky enough to have been held up as a role model and as an example to young women in Africa that they too can achieve their dreams with perseverance, hard work, and a load of self-belief. This is not always a role that came easy for me. I'm more comfortable in the flight deck, but in 2009, I took a leap and founded SAWIA, which stands for Southern African Women in Aviation and Aerospace Industry. My intention was to help empower women across Africa to enter the industry by providing mentorship and financial support. This has become a personal passion of mine, and while I cherished my time as a helicopter pilot and as a regional airline pilot in South Africa, I've come to realize that my story holds value, not only for women, and African women in particular, but for any individuals out there trying to break through a barrier or a glass ceiling, or a cultural divide, or a socially enforced class structure. But to get to a point where I could positively impact others, started with my own drive to succeed. My first introductory flight happened after I completed my degree, and it was in a Cessna 172 aeroplane at a local flying club. I just fell in love with the sensation, and I knew I wasn't going to do anything else in my life. So I started taking flying lessons. I was also fortunate enough to be offered free flight instructions by a local flight instructor. I only had to pay for fuel. He was also a captain of an airline that I flew for as a cabin attendant. I used the money that I earned as a cabin attendant to pay for the fuel, but I could only afford 1 hour of fuel a month, as I still needed to pay for my university student loans. And I remember how I had to take 5 minibus taxis, not quite the fancy New York cabs, but crowded minivans, and would spend 3 hours on the road just to get to the airport for my lessons. But I was hooked. I started to bombard companies with letters asking for sponsorship, for help in attaining the qualification I needed to become a commercial pilot. The South African Police Services responded, and after selections, I joined their cadet program. Yes, there were many challenges, but there were also some lighter moments along the way. For example, I discovered that I was too short to reach the rudder pedals in an aeroplane. So I used to carry an elevator cushion with me all the time. In the helicopters, I was too light to fly solo. I weighed 105 pounds, and the minimum solo weight required for a Robinson 22 was 130 pounds. So I had to walk around with extra weights or sandbag to put under the seat in the helicopter to make up for the required weight to balance the center of gravity whenever I had to do a solo flight. Nothing beat a little bit of bodybuilding on the job. In 2004, I earned a private pilot license in aeroplane, and in 2005, I earned a commercial pilot for helicopters, becoming the first Black woman to fly helicopters commercially in South Africa. I also went to become the first African person of either gender, male or female, to serve as a helicopter pilot in the South African Police Services. As a police helicopter pilot, I flew missions that include anti-narcotics operations, border patrol, crime prevention, crime callouts, search and rescue. Yes, I met people who did not want me to be there, who questioned my ability. Equally, I had people that supported me. I went on to achieve many other firsts in the 18 years that I've been in the aviation industry. After decades with the police services and obtaining my fixed-wing commercial pilot license, I joined a regional airline as a junior first officer on the CRJ 200 for just under 2 years. Back then, I was still part of a select group. Today, with only 4% of South Africa's 17,000 pilots' license being held by Black people and less than 8% by women, I'm still among a select few. This is not just an African reality. According to the International Society of Women Airline Pilots, of which Beverley is one of the founders, in 2018, women accounted for just 5.18% for the pilots at 34 major airlines in the world. While at points in my career, I had been fortunate enough to have received support from my colleagues and superiors, almost exclusively men, I might add, for the most part, I faced a lack of mentorship and encouragement. This was particularly true during my training. I lacked female role models and female contemporaries who I could share with and whom I could turn to for support. I handled the many gender challenges facing women in the aviation sector by proactively seeking other women, supportive male pilots, and professionals, and by letting the quality of my work break down the stereotypes I encountered. These biases came at me from both sides, as a woman, notably as a Black woman. At each stage in my career, I was bombarded with requests for interviews and speaking engagement because I was the first. But being the first brings with it a huge amount of responsibility. As anyone who's ever piloted a plane or helicopter knows, this comes with a job. But breaking barriers bring with it a unique type of pressure. It means acknowledging that others had tried and failed to make it to this point, but the groundwork they laid has contributed to your success. It is for this reason that I actually don't choose to focus on being the first, but rather on the young women who will follow, who must follow the 20th, the 50th to take the sky. I do this through the Girls Fly Program in Africa Foundation, a nonprofit organization I founded which aims to make aviation an accessible and a viable career path for girls and women through participating in discussion like this. After all, you never know who's listening. The foundation is currently operating in South Africa, Cameroon, and Botswana, and will be expanding to Uganda, Kenya, and Nigeria in 2019. One of our signature programs is the 5-day aviation and aerospace camp, where girls get to do their introductory flights. And the camp was chosen and featured by BBC as one of the 8 inspiring innovations in Africa. Through our work, we've been able to inspire these girls by simply giving them access to role models who look like them and whose story they resonate with. This is how you build aspirations, and this is how you create a generation that believe they can. To date, we've impacted 100,000 youth across Africa, and our girls have gone on to become aeronautical engineers, pilots, and aircraft maintenance engineers. Across the world, and not just in Africa, girls are often not encouraged to dream big. If they pursue a career at all, they are molded into socially acceptable, conventional jobs and are encouraged into nurturing roles, supporting husbands, children, and families. It is my belief that if we do not prepare these young women today for the jobs of the future, and by this I mean encouraging them towards careers in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, then we are lost. Aviation is hugely important to me. It offers an array of diverse career opportunities, but it's not the only avenue open to young women. The secret, though, is to put it on the table, to make it an option, to make it accessible, to make a dream attainable. Personally, I'm far from finished on my quest for learning. After taking a break from flying, I obtained my master's in 2017, and now armed with vital business knowledge, I'm working to combine my passion for aviation with my drive to empower and support women in a more sustainable way. I'm building businesses and organizations with a social conscience, and that excites me. Today, I also fly as a certified flight instructor and as a contract pilot for both helicopters and airplanes, with the intention of going back to fly for the airlines in 2019. In Africa, we have a word you might probably heard of. It's called Ubuntu. It is a multi-layered philosophy which carries with it a great deal of weight for those of us lucky enough to call Africa a home. Generally, Ubuntu is translated into English, I am because we are. It talks of the bond we share as human beings, the necessity of supporting one another, of sharing and lifting as we rise. In my experience, this is how we break boundaries in the sky. We make ourselves visible and accessible to the next generation, and we put Ubuntu into action. Thank you.
have the luckiest job in the entire auditorium tonight. I get to sit this close to these fantastic individuals, fantastic pilots, and fantastic speakers. Thank you all, each, for really inspiring us tonight. This is the interactive part where we get to follow up with our panelists and ask the questions that we want answered to kind of continue this story. And as the moderator, I get to go first, but I won't have the last word. I'm really struck by that infection that all of us probably in this room have felt at one point in time, that aviation could be this dream of kind of fulfilling this Icarus human destiny, right, of desiring to fly, and you put it into action in your lives despite the adversity that you experienced. I'm curious too, because each of you has had this sort of dedication to Ubuntu, this dedication to building a life for the next generation that will make it easier for people of color, for women to enter this profession. Where do you think we stand now, either in the United States or in the South African example, of building an aviation culture that really is open in a way that you would have encountered less so in your own experiences?
I think looking back, probably 18 years ago to today, there has been some major strides. I started off as the first, obviously, black woman to fly, and there was another lady that I flew with in the SAPS, but by the time I left, there were about 10 plus women flying there. In the airlines as well. I didn't show the statistics of some of our domestic airlines in South Africa, and we're sitting at about 9%, which is more than the global average. So there is a lot that has happened in the last 18 years. In Africa, we've got airlines such as Kenya Airways, Ethiopian Airlines that have taken it upon themselves to actually support women initiatives by having an all-female crew flying all over the world and making sure that the world knows about it. So I think there is an effort that has been taken all over the world in a very positive way to make sure that the numbers are increasing. So we are definitely getting there.
Well, I know in my industry, when I first started in 1988, less than 1/2 of 1% of the airline pilots were black. Now it's roughly 2. We've got roughly 90,000, 100,000 major airline pilots out there, 124,000 total commercial pilots. So there's been some movement, but there's always room for improvement. The biggest thing I found nowadays is just exposure to the actual idea of flying the airplane as opposed to sitting in your house and thinking that you can't do it, versus years ago, pure discrimination that was overt and also subtle. So things have changed, and I look forward to the future where we have an actual pilot shortage, which will increase the number of folks getting into aviation, not just as pilots, but to have fulfilling careers. So things have changed over time.
They have changed, but I still remain very surprised that women only represent 5%. I mean, we've been flying for 45 years as far as, you know, when the first female pilot was hired. And I'm disappointed that our numbers aren't higher. And I'm always surprised about that because so many women will say, you know, I never knew I could do that. But honestly, the doors are so open today. I mean, women, in my day, we couldn't fly as pilots in the military, but they can do that today. They can be combat pilots, they can be fighter pilots, they can really do everything. And I think one of the biggest drawbacks is so many women feel like they can't raise a family and be a pilot. And I'm always so surprised at that because what I want to say to them is an airline pilot is home more than any working mother. If you take a mother who works 5 days a week at a bank, they work more than Most airline pilots do. The difference is that when we go on our trips, we're really gone. We might be on the other side of the world or, in Asia or in Europe. But, my last 10 years with American, I flew 9 days a month. And that means a lot of days off. So it really was a wonderful career to raise children.
Are there questions from the audience? And here's how we'll do this, is that we don't have you all mic'd, but if you could just speak loudly enough that I can hear you, I'll kind of reiterate your question to the larger audience, and then we'll have the panel respond. Yeah.
Is there any anecdote or moment from your career or from your time in Gander that didn't make it into Come From Away that you want to tell us?
So the question is, are there any anecdotes or moments from your 5 days in Gander that didn't make it into Come From Away that you would be willing to share with us this evening?
Well, the playwrights will tell you that they left Gander with 16,000 stories. So they wanted to tell so much more than what actually ended up in the play. And what they've told us is the first draft that they wrote was 8 hours long, and we hadn't even gotten off of the airplanes. So, yeah, there were a lot of stories. But for me personally, what was a little bit unique is I was pretty much sequestered to the motel, so I didn't mingle with the people in the town, and quite frankly, I didn't know many of the stories until I saw the play, because we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have pagers, and I never knew when I was going to get the call from American to, get dressed and head to the airport. So I didn't get out and about. So I didn't have a lot of stories. And it wasn't until I saw the show, and of course I've learned about all of them. And what was important to me is last summer I was able to take my children and my husband back, and we went to all of the communities that are portrayed in the show that helped all of the passengers, and I personally had the opportunity to thank the mayor of every one of those towns, and that was important to me. So I don't have any specific story because I didn't do much. I ate at the same restaurant for 5 days.
That's great. Yes, sir. The question is, why are the participation rates, so with 5% women, 2% African Americans, why are they still so low, especially if the doors are more open?
I think that's the big disappointment for us. And the Women Airline Pilot Group that we founded in 1978, we started with 21 members. We have about 540 members today. So we are growing from that aspect. But as far as the women who are actually flying for the airlines, the numbers are just still low. And we find that to be hugely disappointing. And I don't know the answer because, as I said, we do so much mentoring. We provide millions of dollars of scholarship money. We do everything we can to support the young women who want to come up in aviation. And to hear that you're only at 2%, it was astounding to me. I didn't even know that.
What are your thoughts, Brad?
Well, one of the reasons is because aviation is not cheap. It's still very expensive, and it's never going to be cheap. And when you have to invest $100,000 as a young person, unless you have a big bank or wealthy parents, it's kind of tough to get into without going into the military. The other thing is, for a long time until recently, there wasn't any advancement in the airline industry. So things weren't moving. And if you're flying for a commuter, and you may think that working 100 hours a month is tough, but when you're flying the route itself in weather and you're getting paid significantly lower to do all that, and you can go over and be a supervisor or get an IT job that pays more, there's less incentive to get involved in the commuter level, which will bring you to the airline level. So that's one of the things. And timing is also everything.
Well, I think, Brad, also another important thing is after 9/11, we in the airline business have what we refer to as the lost decade. the airlines literally went 10 years before we could start to rebound. I know American Airlines did not hire a single pilot for 10 years, so we spent a lot of time after 9/11 just trying to get back on our feet. As you know, almost every airline declared bankruptcy, and there were a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and many airlines went completely out of business. So there was a 10-year period where really nothing got done.
Rafilwa, you spoke of optimism, but at the same time, we could look at that number of 9% and be a little bit frustrated. So why are the numbers so low?
I think in South Africa, we're looking at socio-economic factors. We've got one of the highest inequality in the world. I think a Gini coefficient of about 0.7. So for a family to go and spend $500,000 or 1 million on a pilot license, it's just not going to happen. So if you don't get through the military or you don't go through with the police or the airlines, then there's no hope. So it is quite expensive. But the other thing in Africa as well, cultural issues. As a woman, our role is still determined somewhere else other than the flight deck. So it's going to take a while to try to overcome those barriers or change those mind shift that perhaps women can do both, fly and sort of have a family.
Other questions? Yeah, in the back, sir, with your hand up. Yes. Right, so the question is also about gender discrimination. We've talked about things that women can do, and the question is, well, what can men do to ameliorate the situation? Any thoughts from the panel on that question?
Well, I'll answer that because I just had the recent opportunity to participate in a program in Miami, and it was actually put on by American, the men, and it was strictly for our female aviators. It was called a leadership program. My daughter and I were the keynote speakers at that event, and that is something very new that's happening. American is working so hard to promote the female aviators, and when I mentioned this to some of my contemporaries at the other airlines, they were just astounded. They're like, your airline paid for an event where you could go and stay in Miami and they gave you food and everything? And I was like, yeah, they did that. And anybody could have gone, but it was strictly for our female pilots. So I actually was very proud that American was getting on board from that respect. It's kind of a big thing and a change in the culture.
Delta has recently instituted some unusual practices, which hopefully they will continue. With the pilot shortage coming up, they've actually expanded not just to women, but cabin crew members, male and female, to say that if you have 100 hours, Delta will actually make an aviation investment for you to continue your aviation skills, hopefully to stay on with the company that you're already working for. And that is something that didn't happen when I was working back in many years ago, to think that the airline is going to actually encourage you and then pay you once they see you've made an initial investment, in this case of 100 hours. That's a fantastic opportunity. And I've flown with at least 3 female flight attendants who are involved in that program, which is fantastic.
I think I was fortunate enough to have a lot of support from men. I remember as well my previous boss, whenever I had to go and do operations with a helicopter, and he would encourage me to actually, when I finish, land at schools and talk to the little kids around. So I think men can, like by supporting the way, if they continue supporting the way I was supported, we're more likely to see more of me coming out.
We do know, we could talk about the culture of piloting as well, and there's plenty of coming out of Hollywood, whether it be The Right Stuff or Top Gun or books. And it does seem like a very masculine culture that may be kind of alienating as well. Is there anything about piloting culture that you've experienced more recently than, say, Top Gun, that that still needs changing in order to be inclusive, whether gender-based or racially?
Well, you know, so often people want to hear the horror stories of what it was like for us in the beginning and how we were treated by the guys and everything. But honestly, I struggle to come up with really negative stories because I was treated wonderfully by the guys. And so many young girls will ask me, how did you survive in a man's world, which obviously the airline business was and still is. And I always say it takes two things. You have to be exceptional at your job, and you have to maintain respect. And if you can do both of those things, honestly, the guys are great to work with. They really are.
I've got a lot of stories that are a little bit more negative that I'm not going to share with you. But my point is, and this is what my parents taught me, and then also other flyers who were older than me who were black, and that is simply the aircraft doesn't care about your gender. It doesn't care about your skin tone, your sexual orientation. It has a certain way that it needs to be flown, and if you can do that correctly and do that respectably with your peers, in most cases, they will respect your flying skills, and then you go home. In some cases, they still have their own biases, and they'll have to address them with themselves and their friends at some point in time.
It's not to say that you get the occasional comment from a passenger. In fact, we were talking in the car coming over here that I remember one time when I was a brand new captain, so I was pretty young, and I had a black co-pilot. And I remember telling him, I said, you know, maybe we should just close the cockpit door while the passengers are boarding, you know, but it was rather unique. I mean, I loved it. I loved flying with him. He was a great pilot. But I just thought, you know, there's a new female captain, a black co-pilot. Let's just keep the cockpit door closed.
Any thoughts on pilot culture in South Africa, whether it needs to change as well?
I actually liked Top Gun, and I liked that look with the overalls, except that they gave me 2 sizes bigger. So in terms of the culture, I mean, obviously there's still those unconscious biases, and we've actually, like you said, been discussing it. And I mean, I could remember a story where we had to go do an operation. So normally I would fly as a pilot, the commander in a helicopter, and I would fly with a crew, an airline officer, and their job would be to control the flare cameras, the night sun, and shoot if there's a need to do that. And we had to carry one passenger who had to do the operations with us. So he came in and he said to us, who's the pilot? I'm like, I'm the pilot, excited with my oversized overalls. And he disappeared. So after a while, I asked my crew, you know, go check where's the passenger. And he found him and he came and called me. He's like, you have to come in and look at this. So we went there and he's been smoking. And I think in 15 minutes, he smoked about 10, 15 cigarettes. That's how nervous he was. So he said to my crew, speaking in Afrikaans, can she fly? And my crew said to him, I don't know. So we got in, and I sat there, obviously had my visor, and I started the aircraft, and then got airborne and hovered steadily. So he started laughing at the back, and my crew looked at him. He's like, why are you laughing? He's like, she can fly. My crew's like, yes, of course she can fly. So yes, we do have, you know, those stories. But I think I've learned throughout my 18 years in the aviation industry that, I mean, you laugh at stories like that. Some people do it unconsciously and they don't realize what they're doing. But the ones that are doing consciously, you need to address it as well. And you need to nip it in the bud there and then. So your attitude plays an important role as well, how you view things. So I've had a lot of those laughing moments.
We have time for one last question. Yes, miss? It's you, yes. So the question is, what advice would the panelists give to someone who wants to fly today, to get into the piloting industry?
I'll take this one. The first thing is it's not easy, so you have to be persistent. Number two, whatever the good old days were back in the 70s and 80s in airline pilot, they're gone. It's a great job, and you have to adjust to the fact that it's going to cost you something, but if you enjoy flying, it's the greatest thing, in fact, in my opinion, that I ever got involved with and to share with others. So I would say be persistent, tenacious. Don't ever take no for an answer. As my father, as I mentioned, you just work your way around these obstacles and find solutions. And there are always challenges, but there are possible solutions. But just remember that it may not be something you can get in a year or two of just going to flight school. But if you want to get involved as a professional, you can get there. It's going to take just some sacrifice, but just don't give up.
Yeah, I would say I totally agree with Brad. It is a long, hard road, but when you love it the way that it's obvious that we do, it's certainly worth it. And so many people do say to me exactly what he said. You know, it's not like it was in the 70s and 80s. People actually used to dress nice to fly, and today they wear their pajamas on the airplanes. But you know, I have a daughter coming up in aviation, and hopefully will be with a major someday. But what I tell so many of my friends is she will never know what it was like for us in the 70s and 80s. She only knows what it's like today going forward, and it is still one of the best jobs in the world.
In addition to what they've said, be prepared to be broke.
On that encouraging note.
Wow. You should know that this lecture series normally ends at 9, and the fact that we've gone over by over a half hour really speaks to how incredible this panel has been, and want to thank you so much for that. You should know that it has been recorded, so that if you'd like to watch it again or share it with friends or family that were unable to be here, it'll be on our website in a couple days, so look for it there. Want to again extend our thanks to GE Aviation for allowing us to sponsor these events, and again for our panelists, and for all of you for coming this evening. We hope you'll join us at future lectures. As you exit the theater, you have to go up the stairs and out, and as we rebuild this place, it'll be truly ADA friendly. So we are going to get better. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. Have a great evening.